Number 1. Zachary Thomas Blanchard was a Tennessee high schooler, 16 years old in early spring of 2014, living in rural Greene County with his father, Robert Blanchard. Classmates and neighbors knew him as a quiet teen who spent most days at home and gravitated toward a small circle of friends. Behind closed doors, family relationships were complicated, but there was no long public record of prior violent behavior. On a Wednesday night in early April, that image unraveled. In the weeks leading up to the shooting, prosecutors later said Zachary was spending increasing time with 3 peers and talking about leaving town. Investigators would point to adolescent bravado, peer influence, and a plan to run off as the situational frame, rather than a clear, long-standing grievance. After the homicide, some family members rejected any suggestion of prior abuse. The state indicated the defense might have raised it at trial, but the case never reached a jury, leaving the alleged motive disputed and unresolved in the record. On the night of April 2nd, prosecutors said Zachary asked his father to help with a task at the backyard chicken coop. When the older man stepped outside, Zachary went back into the house, washed his hands, retrieved his father's pistol, returned to the coop, and fired a single, fatal shot. Rather than linger at the scene, he gathered credit cards, ammunition, and firearms, and contacted the friends who would join him in fleeing across state lines. A stark text message went out to those peers. "It is done." The victim, a father in his mid-30s, was found in the coop a short time later. Through the night and into the next day, law enforcement agencies in Tennessee and South Carolina searched for the teens. The group was spotted by a farmer and taken into custody near a rural highway crossing in Newberry County after a manhunt that officials described as lasting about 10 hours. Authorities said the group appeared to be headed toward Myrtle Beach. In Tennessee, Zachary was charged as an adult with first-degree murder. The other teens faced accessory and theft counts, with their matters handled in juvenile court. Detectives assembled a straightforward case. A timeline built from the call to the father, the recovery of the handgun, the items taken from the home, the interstate flight, the text message, and the eventual arrests. There was no extended forensic mystery. The tension in court centered on why it happened and how to classify it under state law. With jury selection approaching more than 2 years later, Zachary entered a negotiated plea, avoiding a trial that might have forced relatives to relive the details and would have pitted disputed narratives about family life against the evidence of planning and flight. In late September of 2016, Zachary pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and received a sentence of 30 years in prison. Multiple outlets reported the plea and sentence on the same day, noting that he had been 16 at the time of the killing and that the state had originally charged him with first-degree murder. The accessory cases tied to the other teens were processed separately in juvenile court. Psychologically, the record supports a picture of adolescent impulsivity amplified by peer dynamics and a desire to run away, rather than a fully articulated ideological motive. Prosecutors flagged the possibility that a trial defense would have raised claims of abuse. Family members publicly denied those assertions. With the plea, no expert testimony on mental health or trauma was litigated to a conclusion, leaving professional assessments scarce in the public file. Zachary Thomas Blanchard is serving a 30-year sentence for second-degree murder in the Tennessee state system, imposed in late September of 2016. Number 2. Jacob Andrew Brown was 16 years old, a Tipton County high school student in West Tennessee, when neighbors knew him mostly as a quiet kid who drifted between friends in Munford. At home, his mother later said he had changed during junior high, pulling away from treatment he had once followed. And those close to him described a teen wrestling with mood swings, poor judgment, and a growing fascination with getting high on synthetic stimulants, sold then as so-called bath salts. The victims were Ed and Bertha Walker, an elderly couple across the street who had lived a steady, familiar life in their neighborhood. On the afternoon of January 18, 2011, their grandson came by for laundry his grandmother had washed. By evening, relatives and neighbors would find the Walkers dead inside their home, and a homicide investigation would begin. In the weeks and hours leading up to the killings, testimony later established that Jacob spent time at a nearby house with a friend whose family had complained about nosy neighbors. A schoolmate drove Jacob from campus that day. On the way, they stopped at a shop where the classmate bought 2 packets of a synthetic stimulant branded as bath salts, which Jacob then used at a skate park. Before returning to the neighborhood, witnesses later saw him pacing, clutching his head, and moving around the friend's yard. The state would later frame the motive as a combustible mix of adolescent bravado, chemical intoxication, and anger at perceived interference, rather than a long-planned vendetta. Inside the Walkers' home, investigators from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation documented a violent scene consistent with a beating by a baseball bat. A neighbor had earlier seen Ed Walker at his mailbox. Later, a relative with a key entered and ran out screaming. The medical examiner testified to fatal blunt force trauma. Jacob's own friend told jurors that Jacob showed him a bat with heavy dents and said he had killed the Walkers, a claim the friend initially refused to believe. By that night, adults in the area had gathered, sirens approached, and detectives began canvassing for anyone who had seen a teenage boy around the Locke residence across from the Walkers. The investigation moved quickly. Agents matched school records showing that Jacob had left early, corroborated accounts of his movements, and traced his presence to a motel in nearby Millington, where officers located him the following day. In statements described in court and in local reporting, Jacob apologized not long after his arrest and later told the court that he heard voices urging him to kill, while an imaginary figure urged him not to do it. A news outlet covering the sentencing reported testimony that he cried for the victims at night. A clinician referenced schizophrenia, and witnesses recounted his use of bath salts around the time of the murders. At trial in Tipton County Circuit Court, jurors heard evidence that Jacob was 16 at the time of the crimes. The juvenile court had transferred him to be tried as an adult. A jury found him guilty on all counts, including premeditated first-degree murder of both Ed and Bertha Walker, and especially aggravated burglary. On appeal, the Court of Criminal Appeals summarized those outcomes, noting that the trial court imposed life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for each murder. The appellate court later modified the burglary conviction to aggravated burglary and remanded for resentencing on that count. But the life without parole sentences for the 2 murders remained in place. Psychologically, the record portrays a troubled adolescent influenced by intoxicants, impulsivity, and grandiose talk among peers. A defense theme touching on mental illness and command-type hallucinations appeared in testimony. Prosecutors emphasized planning behaviors, post-offense statements, and the physical evidence. No single clinical conclusion erased culpability at trial, and the legal process fixed its judgment on the acts and their consequences rather than an agreed-upon medical diagnosis. Jacob Andrew Brown is serving life imprisonment without the possibility of parole in the Tennessee state system for the murders of Ed and Bertha Walker. Number 3. Natasha Cornett was 18 years old when she left eastern Kentucky with 5 friends on a restless road trip that cut through East Tennessee in early April 1997. She had left school years earlier, drifted between couches, and carried herself like a runaway looking for a new start. The group's car limped along the interstate. At a rest area, they crossed paths with the Lillelids, a family heading home from a religious gathering. Vidar and Delphina with their daughter Tabitha and toddler Peter. What began as small talk by the picnic tables spiraled into a carjacking and a forced ride toward the backroads of Greene County. The encounter would end on a gravel lane called Payne Hollow, and the case would follow Natasha for the rest of her life. Friends and reporters later sketched a patchwork of possible triggers: a desire to flee home, a fascination with dark aesthetics, and the volatile dynamics of 6 teens chasing a fantasy of escape. Investigators rejected any single neat motive. Some defendants later claimed they did not know what was about to happen. Prosecutors argued that, once the family was taken at gunpoint, the path to violence was tragically clear. The retired detective who walked that scene for years afterward called it a crime of opportunity, a moment where too many reckless choices converged. On the evening of April 6, 1997, the Lillelids were driven off the interstate to a rural pull-off. What happened in those minutes has been told and retold with small differences. And even in court, the exact identity of the shooters remained disputed. What is undisputed is the outcome. Vidar and Delphina died at the scene. Tabitha died soon after. Peter survived with life-changing injuries, including the loss of sight in one eye. The group fled in the family's van, leaving behind their own disabled car. The manhunt spanned states. 2 days later, customs agents intercepted the stolen van at the border in Arizona after Mexican police refused the group entry for lack of proper documents. When they were brought back to Tennessee, media coverage was relentless, and crowds gathered as the six appeared in custody. From the start, investigators said more than one firearm had been used, and courtroom narratives diverged over who fired and when. Facing capital charges, the defendants entered coordinated pleas before a jury could be seated. Natasha Cornett and the 3 other adults pleaded to first-degree felony murder and related counts. The 2 younger teens did as well. The court imposed life sentences without the possibility of parole for each murder, plus an additional term for the attempted murder of Peter. Appellate records in later years continued to reflect those outcomes, and filings by co-defendant Karen Howell confirmed consecutive life without parole sentences with an added term for the surviving child. Psychologically, the public record shows no single clinical through-line for Natasha that neutralizes responsibility or fully explains the crime. The sensational rumors about occult beliefs that once dominated headlines did not materialize into courtroom proof, and prosecutors themselves later called that theme a distraction. The broader picture is of impulsive youth, group pressure, and a sudden pivot from petty drifting to catastrophic harm. Years into her sentence, Natasha's name surfaced again when officials alleged she assisted death row inmate Krista Pike in an attempted strangling of another prisoner during a fire alarm. Pike was convicted of attempted first-degree murder and received an additional sentence. Investigators said there was not enough evidence to charge Natasha. The episode nonetheless followed her into case files and news archives. Natasha Wallen Cornett is serving life imprisonment without the possibility of parole at a Tennessee state facility for her role in the murders of Vidar, Delphina, and Tabitha Lillelid, with additional time imposed for the attempted murder of Peter. Number 4. Myeisha Brown was 16 years old when her name entered Nashville's headlines in early winter of 2017. She grew up in the city's public schools, known to some teachers as capable but inconsistent. A teenager balancing family pressures and a widening circle of older friends. On an afternoon in early November, along Claiborne Street in South Nashville, 74-year-old Ruxin Wang stepped outside his son's recently purchased home to bring in the trash can. Moments later, neighbors heard shots. Police and paramedics arrived to find a neighborhood stunned and a family suddenly broken. In the weeks that followed, detectives traced rumors about a dispute among teens, talk of easy money, and the draw of a borrowed gun. Friends described Myeisha as restless and impressionable, toggling between bravado and vulnerability. Investigators did not present a single neat motive. Instead, they mapped a pattern common to adolescent offenders: impulsive decision-making, the magnifying effect of peer approval, and the belief that a risky act would carry no real consequence. The emotional volatility around that time surfaced again at a later hearing, when witnesses said they saw her lift a weapon but could not attest to watching the crucial instant itself. Police arrested Myeisha within weeks of the shooting, initially taking her to juvenile detention. A judge later ruled that, given the severity of the charge and her record, she would be tried as an adult for criminal homicide. Early the next year, she secured release on bond through an online campaign that triggered public controversy and a backlash from the victim's family, who said they felt voiceless as they watched the process unfold. Soon after, her bond was revoked following a new arrest, and she returned to custody, while the homicide case moved toward a plea. Court records and local reporting show that in late 2020, Myeisha entered a guilty plea to a reduced charge and received a 15-year sentence in state prison. The outcome spared both families a contested trial and locked in a punishment that would keep her incarcerated through much of her 20s and early 30s, subject to the ordinary rules of credit and discipline. For Ruxin Wang's son, the courtroom was a place to speak about his parents' long marriage and the years of caregiving his father had already given inside that home. He told reporters he saw no remorse in early encounters and asked that the justice system remember the life his father built over nearly 5 decades. Psychologically, the available record offers only fragments. There was no publicly released comprehensive evaluation that resolved motive into a single diagnosis. The portrait that emerges is of an adolescent drawn into a reckless moment, amplified by peers and access to a gun, with consequences that were immediate and irreversible. Prosecutors emphasized accountability and the impact on a family. The defense pressed for a resolution that recognized youth and the possibility of change. The plea left many disputed details forever outside the scrutiny of a jury, including the exact sequence of events in those crucial seconds on Claiborne Street. Myeisha Brown was serving a 15-year sentence at the Deborah K. Johnson Rehabilitation Center when she was found dead in her cell on Saturday, March 19, 2022. The Tennessee Department of Correction opened a death investigation, and local outlets reported the case without immediate details about the manner or cause. An obituary published by her family marked her birth in late January of 2001 and her death in mid-March of 2022. Number 5. Angel Bumpass was a 13-year-old 8th grader in Chattanooga when her name became tied to a cold case that had haunted a neighborhood for years. Classmates remembered a quiet, creative girl who loved art projects and helped around the house. The victim was Franklin Bonner, a 68-year-old retiree known to neighbors and to his family as steady and dependable. In mid-January of 2009, he was found dead inside his home, and the investigation that followed would stretch across nearly a decade before circling back to a teenager who, at the time of the crime, had been in middle school. Detectives revisited the case years later. A new look at evidence recovered from the scene focused on duct tape used during the robbery. After a cold case review and another run of latent prints, 2 partial fingerprints were said to match Angel. That single development transformed a dormant file into an active prosecution. Despite the absence of messages, calls, or photographs linking her to any older co-defendant, the state's theory placed her alongside an adult, Mallory Vaughn, though the two were not shown to have known each other well, if at all. The trial arrived in early autumn of 2019. Jurors heard that Angel's prints were on the tape, that the home had been ransacked, and that a jailhouse witness claimed Vaughn had confessed to taking part in a violent robbery that turned fatal. The same jury acquitted Vaughn but convicted Angel of first-degree felony murder and an associated robbery count. She was sentenced to life imprisonment, a result that left the community divided, and her family insistent that the partial prints had an innocent explanation connected to household duct tape used in crafts and chores. In the months that followed, her defense documented what it called cumulative errors, prejudicial testimony, investigative notes from a detective facing unrelated misconduct allegations, and unresolved questions about other unidentified prints. In early September of 2022, the criminal court judge who presided at trial, Tom Greenholtz, granted a new trial, writing that the combined effect of mistakes warranted starting over. The ruling moved Angel from a life sentence toward another day in court and reopened debates about the reliability and context of partial fingerprint evidence in an older case. By late summer of 2023, the legal landscape shifted again. Hamilton County District Attorney Cody Wamp told the court that, in the state's view, the manner of the crime made it virtually impossible for a 13-year-old working alone to have carried out what happened inside that house. She cited new assessments, including polygraph examinations administered by law enforcement, in explaining the state's position. On the same August morning, Judge Amanda Dunn dismissed the case, ending the prosecution and allowing Angel to walk out of court with her attorneys. Local coverage captured her saying she planned to finish school and focus on her children. Across media discussions and legal filings, Angel's psychological portrait is fragmentary rather than clinical. There were no public records of a definitive diagnosis that explained guilt or innocence. Instead, her story turned on the intersection of a teenager's ordinary life and a forensic link that, standing alone, persuaded one jury and later failed to survive judicial scrutiny and prosecutorial reevaluation. Supporters argued that group dynamics and older actors likely drove the crime. The state ultimately agreed that its evidence no longer justified continuing the case against her. Angel Bumpass's convictions were vacated, and on Tuesday, August 8th of 2023, The charges against her were dismissed in Hamilton County Criminal Court. Number 6. Jacob Lee Carney was 17 years old, a high schooler living in Clarksville with his grandmother, Mary Lou Carney, who had legally adopted him. Friends knew Jacob as a quiet teen who kept to himself, and relatives described Mary as a steady presence in the family. A woman in her late 60s who opened her home on Ellsworth Drive to the people she loved. In the early hours of a Monday in mid-May 2020, Mary's longtime partner, James Williard, rose from the living room to check a noise from the kitchen while he recovered from recent heart surgery. What followed inside that small house would leave one person gravely injured, one person dead, and a family stunned by how quickly an ordinary night turned tragic. In the months and years that investigators later reviewed, no single clean motive emerged. Prosecutors would say they never received a definitive explanation from Jacob about what pushed him over the edge that night. Those who knew the household spoke of a teen wrestling with private turmoil, but there was no public record of an established history that could fully account for the sudden escalation. The portrait that formed was of a young man whose judgment collapsed in a dark, silent hour, with stressors that remain largely unspoken in the official record. Just after 1 o'clock in the morning, James heard the noise again and called out Jacob's name. A light snapped on. In the confrontation that followed, James was wounded as he tried to stop the attack. Mary hurried from her room and intervened to protect him. When police forced the front door a short time later, they found James barricaded in the bedroom, bleeding but alive, and Mary on the floor beyond help. Jacob was located in a back room of the home. Responding officers secured the scene and turned it over to detectives and the medical examiner, who documented extensive sharp force injuries. Clarksville detectives interviewed witnesses, gathered physical evidence, and traced Jacob's movements inside the home. He was arrested the same day and initially charged in juvenile court. Because of the severity of the case, a judge later transferred him to adult court to face first-degree murder and attempted first-degree murder. Early coverage also noted the domestic dynamics at the center of the case. Mary was Jacob's biological grandmother and adoptive parent. The surviving victim, James, provided statements that helped prosecutors reconstruct those minutes room by room. As pretrial hearings continued, the legal narrative focused less on why than on what could be proven. Prosecutors laid out the timeline. The defense pressed the absence of a clear motive. With a jury trial looming, Jacob entered a negotiated plea. In early March of 2024, he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder for Mary's death and to the attempted first-degree murder of James. The court imposed life imprisonment for the murder and an additional term for the attempted murder to run at the same time, an outcome that still leaves him serving a life sentence in the Tennessee system. Public reaction reflected the shock of a domestic homicide. Neighbors who had waved from porches tried to make sense of a scene that unfolded behind a familiar door, and relatives spoke of a woman remembered in obituary pages for her kindness and devotion to her children and grandchildren. In court, prosecutors emphasized the gravity of the injuries and the vulnerability of the victims. The defense did not offer a comprehensive psychological diagnosis, and Jacob himself gave no sustained explanation for the violence. The case ended not with a dramatic trial, but with a plea and a sentence that closed the file on guilt, while leaving motive largely unanswered. Jacob Lee Carney is serving life imprisonment with the possibility of parole for the murder of Mary Lou Carney, alongside a concurrent term for the attempted murder of James Williard. Number 7. Zachary Everett Davis was 15 years old, a quiet high school freshman in Hendersonville, Tennessee, when his family life narrowed to a small brick home shared with his mother, Melanie Davis, and his older brother. Teachers later described an introverted teen who kept to himself after his father died from a degenerative illness years earlier. By late summer of 2012, he was spending most nights in his room, sketching, reading, and playing games, with few close friends and little interest in after-school activities. On a warm August evening, that withdrawn routine gave way to a crime that would define the rest of his life. In the months before the killing, relatives and school staff had noted depression and social isolation. Court records show that mental health questions were raised repeatedly, including competency evaluations and testimony from experts who disagreed over diagnoses. Even so, The legal findings were consistent. Whatever he was struggling with, he understood the difference between right and wrong. Those proceedings also documented a growing fixation on dark themes, entries in a notebook, and searches that prosecutors would later argue spoke to intent rather than confusion. Late that night in early August, investigators concluded Zachary attacked his mother inside the home and then turned to a plan that endangered his older brother, who was asleep in another room. Prosecutors said he tried to set the house on fire, a detail that anchored a separate charge of aggravated arson. The next hours unfolded quickly. A 911 call. First responders forcing their way inside, and sheriff's office investigators taking Zachary into custody. The sequence of events, what happened, when it happened, and who was present was later laid out in sworn testimony and exhibits for a Sumner County jury. At trial in mid-April of 2015, jurors found him guilty of first-degree murder for his mother's death, attempted first-degree murder for his brother, and aggravated arson. Coverage from the courtroom captured a portrait of a teenager who rarely showed emotion, and post-verdict reporting noted his earlier jailhouse interview on a national talk show where clinicians and commentators debated whether his flat affect reflected anxiety, psychosis, or calculated detachment. Whatever the optics, the legal bottom line held. The jury returned guilty on all counts. Sentencing came in early June of the same year. Under Tennessee law, a life sentence equals 60 years, with parole eligibility after 51 years. The judge then imposed 2 additional 20-year terms, one for attempted first-degree murder and one for aggravated arson ordered to run at the same time as each other, but after the life term, creating a stacked punishment that journalists summarized as at least 71 years before release is possible. The Court of Criminal Appeals later affirmed, rejecting claims that the structure amounted to an unconstitutional life without parole sentence for a juvenile because parole eligibility technically remains. From a psychological standpoint, the record reads as fragments rather than one conclusive diagnosis. Evaluations documented depression after his father's death, social withdrawal, and unusual mannerisms. Experts disagreed about the presence and weight of more serious disorders, and the trial court ultimately found him competent and not legally insane at the time of the offenses. The state's narrative emphasized planning, post-offense conduct, and statements that suggested awareness and intent. The defense urged the court to consider profound adolescent impairment. Those competing pictures were never reconciled by a single clinical finding, and the appellate court left the verdicts undisturbed. Zachary Everett Davis is serving a life sentence in the Tennessee Department of Correction, with parole eligibility after 51 years, followed by concurrent 20-year terms ordered to begin after the life sentence. Number 8. William Riley Gaul was a freshman wide receiver at a small Tennessee college, 18 years old, when the relationship he had begun in high school with Emma Walker finally ended. Friends of Emma, a Central High cheerleader a little younger than he was, described the breakup as firm and overdue. She wanted distance, and he would not accept it. In the weeks that followed, the public image of a popular athlete cracked, revealing a pattern that those close to the teens later called controlling, obsessive, and escalating. By late autumn of 2016, the story had moved from hallway rumors to law enforcement files. The unraveling began with strange messages, staged drama, and fear. Emma received texts from an unknown number hinting at danger, and she stepped outside a friend's house to find Gaul lying in a ditch, claiming he had been kidnapped. Days later, a figure dressed in black prowled her neighborhood and banged on her door. Prosecutors would argue these acts were calculated attempts to draw attention and sympathy, to force renewed contact. The defense would later claim they were the odd, immature ploys of a heartbroken teen. Either way, the behavior signaled a shift from sulking to stalking, priming a far more serious act. Just before dawn on a Monday in late November, Emma slept in her Sturchy Hills bedroom while her family rested in nearby rooms. Outside, in the cold dark behind the house, shots were fired through her bedroom wall. The trajectory was precise, at a height and angle prosecutors said reflected intimate knowledge of where she slept. Inside, panic and disbelief. Outside, whoever pulled the trigger slipped into the night. Emma did not survive. The death of a bright, strong-willed teenager jolted Knoxville and set off a homicide investigation that focused quickly on the ex-boyfriend she had tried to leave behind. Detectives asked Gaul's closest friends for help. In a tense, wired meetup, those friends secretly recorded him as he tried to dispose of a handgun, a moment that became a cornerstone of the case. Investigators recovered the weapon and tied it to the shooting. They built a timeline that folded in the staged kidnapping, the masked figure, the breakup, and the social media posts that followed Emma's death. When the case reached a Knox County courtroom in late spring, jurors heard that Gaul had fired from outside the Walker home, and they saw and heard the recordings his friends made at detectives' request. The defense told the jury Gaul never meant to kill Emma, that he fired to scare her, to then reappear as a rescuer and win back her trust. Prosecutors countered that he knew exactly where to aim and why, and they urged the panel to see planning, not panic. After several hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty on first-degree murder and on related counts, including felony murder, stalking, tampering with evidence, theft, and possession of a firearm during a dangerous felony, and reckless endangerment. The courtroom gasped as the verdicts were read, and deputies led Gaul away. Psychologically, the record offers no single authoritative diagnosis. What it does show is possessiveness that slid into surveillance, a craving for control, and a willingness to script threats to engineer contact. Prosecutors framed it as anger and entitlement fed by a refusal to accept a breakup. The defense cast it as catastrophic immaturity. Appellate courts later upheld the verdicts, modifying a theft count but leaving the murder conviction and the major findings undisturbed. Under Tennessee law, a life sentence carries parole eligibility only after 51 years. The trial judge imposed life for the murder, and Gaul's additional convictions drew concurrent terms. He is incarcerated in the state system and will not be eligible to meet the parole board until well into the 2070s. Number 9. Amanda Dawn McGhee was 15 years old in late June of 2007. A high schooler living in the Solway area of Knox County, Tennessee. At home, tension centered on her relationship with Andrew Bryan Mann, a boyfriend in his early 20s whom her family strongly opposed. Prosecutors and reporters later described a household trying to hold boundaries as a teenager pushed back and a secret romance deepened. In the days before the violence, McGhee was pregnant, and the couple's plans shifted from teenage defiance into something far darker. Investigators and court records later outlined weeks of planning. In a recorded statement, McGhee said she and Mann first talked about a chemical plan, then pivoted to using her father's handgun. The picture that emerges is not of a spontaneous outburst, but of a scheme tested and revised, driven by a young couple convinced that removing obstacles would clear the way for a life together. Even so, no single coherent motive survives the record beyond the mix of adolescent rebellion, pregnancy, and pressure. On a Friday near the end of June, the plan moved from talk to action inside the family's Jolly Lane home. Terrence McGhee, in his early 60s, was attacked first in his bedroom. In her statement, Amanda recounted calling her stepmother, Elisa, at work telling her she loved her, and asking when she would be home, then waiting for her return. When Elisa, in her early 40s, arrived, she was met at the door and fatally shot. The sequence, later relayed through taped statements and trial testimony, emphasized control and choreography rather than a chaotic confrontation. Neighbors and relatives discovered the scene and called for help. Knox County detectives built a timeline from phone records, the taped confession, and physical evidence inside the house. Mann was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. McGhee, initially held in juvenile custody where she gave birth to the couple's child, was transferred to adult court because of the seriousness of the crimes. In December of the following year, a jury convicted Mann on both counts, and he received 2 life sentences. Months later, in midsummer of 2009, McGhee pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder. The court imposed consecutive terms that together total 45 years. The courtroom record adds texture to the aftermath. During Mann's trial, jurors heard tearful testimony from the friend who found the victims and from family members describing the shock that rippled across the community. Mann himself took the stand and claimed his pregnant girlfriend pleaded with him to carry out the plan. For us, a narrative the jury ultimately rejected. For McGhee, the resolution came not by verdict but by plea. Her allocution, acknowledging responsibility, and closing the door on a contested trial that would have forced loved ones to relive each step of the plot. Psychologically, the files suggest dynamics more than diagnoses. A 15-year-old pregnant girl entwined with an older boyfriend. Resentment toward parental rules and an escalating fantasy that violence would solve a family conflict. Appeals documents in Mann's case repeatedly reference that he acted at McGhee's urging, while simultaneously underscoring that he alone chose to pull the trigger. Taken together, they portray a feedback loop of manipulation and dependence rather than a single clinical condition. Years later, McGhee petitioned for post-conviction relief on her sentence, an avenue Tennessee law allows. Coverage noted the filing without reporting any reduction. Amanda Dawn McGhee is serving an effective 45-year sentence in the Tennessee state prison system for the second-degree murders of Terrence and Elisa McGhee. Number 10. Ethen Vanderpool was 15 years old. A homeschooled Wilson County teen who had previously attended local public schools. When his life intersected with that of J. Sean Taylor, a Mount Juliet High School junior, known for his easy smile and big plans. On a night in November of 2018, the boys met at the house where Ethen was living, along with two girls their age. What began as a hangout turned into a fatal encounter that would end one life and define the other. In the days leading up to the shooting, messages recovered by investigators showed Ethen expressing unease about J. Sean coming over. Testimony later described a volatile mix of adolescent posturing, glue sniffing, and an unsecured handgun brought out during the gathering. A witness said the weapon slipped off the bed and slid beneath it. When one of the girls knelt to retrieve it, Ethen became jealous over how he thought J. Sean looked at her. Moments later, he grabbed J. Sean by the shirt, forced him back onto the bed, and a single shot followed. The state would frame the motive as impulsive anger fueled by substance use and teenage jealousy rather than a long-planned attack. Police first handled the matter in juvenile court, but the case was transferred to adult court in early spring of 2019 because of the seriousness of the charge. Bond was later set at $1 million as the case moved toward trial. Years stretched on while Ethen remained in custody, and jurors finally heard testimony in late summer of 2022. After weighing eyewitness accounts, texts, and the chain of events inside that bedroom, a Wilson County jury convicted him of second-degree murder. At sentencing in late January of the following year, the judge imposed a term of 22 years in the Tennessee Department of Correction. The court credited him for time already served since his arrest, meaning a substantial portion of the sentence would still extend into his 30s. Coverage of the hearing emphasized the court's acceptance of the jury's finding that Ethen's act was knowing and not accidental, while also acknowledging his youth at the time of the shooting. For J. Sean's family, the proceeding closed the criminal chapter, but not the grief that began the night he died. Within months, Ethen was transferred from the Wilson County Jail to the Northwest Correctional Complex in Tiptonville. In early November of 2023, correctional officials announced he had been found unresponsive in his cell and later pronounced dead, prompting a routine investigation and autopsy. The Tennessean reported a few weeks afterward that the medical examiner ruled his death accidental, caused by parafluorofentanyl and heroin toxicity, with metabolites of heroin detected. The findings confirmed what officials had not been able to say immediately. Ethen died of a drug overdose while in state custody. Psychologically, the public record offers no comprehensive clinical diagnosis that neatly explains the crime. What emerges instead is a portrait common to some adolescent homicides: volatile emotions, intoxicants, access to a firearm, and a split-second choice with irreversible consequences. Prosecutors stressed jealousy and recklessness. The defense sought to place the event within the fog of teenage bravado and poor judgment under the influence. Those competing narratives were resolved in the courtroom by the jury's verdict and the judge's sentence, not by a unifying psychological label. Ethen Vanderpool was serving a 22-year sentence for second-degree murder when he died in state custody in early November of 2023. The medical examiner determined the death was accidental, due to parafluorofentanyl and heroin toxicity.